good evening, and welcome back to Quiet History. Tonight, we're going back to the year 1356, a time before hospitals, before running water, before soap, before toilet paper, before anything we take for granted today even existed. Imagine waking up tomorrow and everything is gone. No medicine when you get sick, no heat when winter comes, no clean water when you're thirsty, no way to stay clean, no way to escape the smell, no way to escape the mud. This is not a story about kings and castles. This is the story of ordinary people, farmers, mothers, children, monks, just trying to survive one more day in medieval Europe. Some of them made it, many of them didn't. Get comfortable. Turn the lights down low. This is 1356.
There is a moment in the deepest part of a winter night when the world holds absolutely still. No sound, no light, no movement of air, only the cold pressing in from every direction at once, finding the gaps in every wall, settling into every surface it touches. It is the kind of cold that a modern person rarely encounters. Not the brief, bracing cold of a walk from a heated car to a heated building, but a cold that has been accumulating for hours, that has had all night to work its way through thatch and timber and wattle, that has extinguished the last warmth of the hearth fire and replaced it with something ancient and indifferent. This is the world of 1356. And this is how it begins, every morning, for almost everyone alive within it. The village exists before it can be seen. In the absolute darkness of a January morning in rural England, the cottages are shapes rather than structures, low, hunched forms against a sky that offers no light, yet no suggestion of the dawn that is still an hour away. The thatched roofs carry a skin of frost that will not melt until mid-morning, if it melts at all. The lanes between the cottages are not lanes in any modern sense. They are channels of compacted mud and animal waste, frozen now into ridges and hollows that will soften to treacherous mire by afternoon. The well at the center of the village square stands silent, its wooden cover sealed with ice that will need to be broken before the first water of the day can be drawn. The stone church at the far end of the lane is the largest structure in the village and the most permanent, and in the darkness it rises above. The cottages, with the quiet authority of something built to outlast every person who has ever sheltered in its shadow. Inside one of these cottages, a family is beginning to wake. The word cottage is perhaps too gentle for what this structure actually is. A single room, roughly 12 feet by 18, built from a frame of bent timber filled in with wattle and daub, woven branches packed with a mixture of clay, dung, and straw, then smoothed and left to dry into a surface that keeps out the worst of the wind, but not the cold, never entirely the cold. The floor is earth beaten hard by years of feet, covered with a layer of rushes that were fresh in October, and are now a compressed mat of dried vegetation, wood ash, animal hair, and the dried remnants of the herbs meadowsweet, lavender, mint, that was strewn among them to release their scent underfoot. The smell of the floor is complex and low, damp earth, old smoke, The faint sweetness of decaying plant matter, the unmistakable presence of the animals that share this space in the coldest months, a goat and 2 chickens whose body heat is not an inconvenience but a contribution. The ceiling is low enough that a tall person must stoop near the walls. It is black, not dark, black, coated over years in the residue of the central hearth, which has no chimney, only a hole in the thatch above it through which smoke escapes when the wind cooperates and fills the room when it does not. The rafters are invisible in the darkness, but they are there, and hanging from them are the practical objects of survival. Bundles of dried herbs, a side of salted pork, wrapped in cloth, a string of onions, a wooden rack, where wet clothing was hung to dry in the warmth that rose from the fire. Everything in this room is within arm's reach of everything else. There is no separation of function, no room for sleeping, distinct from the room for eating or the room for working. There is only the room and the hearth at its center, and the family arranged around both. The hearth is the reason the room is survivable. It is a shallow depression in the earthen floor, ringed with stones, and what remains in it now is not fire, but the memory of fire, a bed of ash and ember that has been banked carefully since last night, covered with ash to slow the burning, to preserve enough heat through the dark hours that the morning's fire can be coaxed back to life without the desperate work of striking flint against steel in the cold. The first person to wake, and it is the woman of the household, always, in this world, in this year, moves toward the hearth before she is fully conscious of moving. Her feet find the rushes. The cold of the floor comes through the thin leather of her shoes, which she has slept in, because to remove them is to wake to something worse. She kneels beside the hearth and begins to work, blowing gently on the embers, pressed, feeding them first with shreds of dried moss and then with small sticks, watching for the moment when the orange deepens and the first small flame appears. It takes time. Everything in this world takes time. The fire does not spring to life at the touch of a switch. The water does not run hot from a tap. The light does not flood the room at the press of a finger. Every comfort must be earned, must be coaxed, must be worked for, with cold hands and patient effort before the day has properly begun. This is perhaps the most fundamental difference between the world of 1356 and the world that will eventually replace it. Not the absence of any single technology, but the cumulative weight of effort required simply to maintain the conditions necessary for survival. Warmth is not a given. Light is not a given. Clean water is not a given. They are achievements, renewed each morning, and they can fail. The straw pallet against the far wall holds the rest of the family, a man, 2 children, and an elderly woman whose breathing is audible in the silence, slow and slightly labored. The sound of lungs that have spent 60 winters in smoky rooms. They sleep beneath 2 wool blankets, rough woven and undyed, the color of the sheep they came from, and beneath those blankets they are pressed together, not from affection alone, but from necessity, sharing body heat the way the animals, in the corner, share it with the room. The straw of the pallet rustles when anyone moves. It was fresh in autumn and is now compacted and beginning to smell of the bodies that have lain in it for months. In spring, it will be turned out and replaced. Until then, it is what there is. The children wake when the fire begins to give real light. They are small, dressed even in sleep, in their rough linen undergarments and wool tunics, their feet wrapped in strips of cloth. Their faces in the firelight are round and serious, the faces of children who have never known a morning that did not begin with cold, who do not experience the cold as an interruption of comfort, but simply as the texture of cold, morning, the way morning feels. The older child, perhaps 8 years old, moves immediately to the water bucket near the door and breaks the thin skin of ice that has formed on its surface overnight. This is a task that requires no instruction. It is simply what is done. Outside, the village is beginning its own slow waking. The rooster in the yard of the cottage, 2 doors down, has begun his announcement, and from the direction of the church, the bell is sounding not the elaborate peal of a Sunday service, but the single, measured toll of prime, the first of the canonical hours, the church's declaration that the night is over and the day has begun. The sound carries through the frozen air with extraordinary clarity, as all sounds do in this cold, and it reaches every cottage in the village simultaneously, a shared signal that requires no translation. The day has been called into existence by that bell, as it is every morning, as it has been for as long as anyone in this village can remember. The lanes between the cottages are beginning to show movement, dark figures moving against the slightly less dark sky, breath visible as brief clouds in the cold air. A woman carries a wooden yoke with 2 buckets toward the well. A man leads an ox from its pen toward the field, the animal's hooves breaking the frozen mud with a sound like cracking wood. Smoke is rising from every thatch now, thin and pale against the sky, and the smell of wood smoke is the smell of the village waking, the smell of morning in 1356, as recognizable and specific as any perfume. It mingles with the other smells that are simply present, always present, in this world, the animal pens, the midden heap at the edge of the yard, the damp earth of the lane, the faint sweetness of the hay stored in the small barn behind the cottage. There is no hot water waiting. There is no warm room to step into, no mirror to consult, no soft towel, no soap that lathers and rinses clean. The morning's washing, for those who wash at all before the day's labor begins, is a brief and bracing affair. A coarse linen cloth, dipped into the water bucket, wrung out, drawn across the face and hands. This is the extent of it. The body beneath the clothing will not meet water today, and perhaps not tomorrow, and perhaps not for many days beyond that. This is not negligence. It is the logic of a world in which water must be carried from a well heated over a fire that consumes wood that must be gathered and split, that must be gathered and split, and in which the medical understanding of the time offers a compelling reason to avoid the practice entirely. The cold air itself is understood as cleansing, The linen against the skin is understood as purifying. The world has its own logic of the clean and the unclean, and it is not our logic, but it is a logic nonetheless. The fire in the hearth is burning properly now. The iron pot has been hung above it on its hook, filled with water and the remnants of yesterday's pottage, beginning the long, slow process of becoming today's meal. The room is warmer, not warm, but warmer, and the light from the fire reaches the walls and shows them in their detail. The rough surface of the daub, the dark timber of the frame, the few objects that constitute the household's possessions, arranged with the careful economy of people who own very little and waste nothing. A wooden chest, a knife hanging from a peg, a small clay lamp that will be lit at dusk with tallow rendered from animal fat, giving a light so faint it barely reaches across the room. The world of 1356 is fully awake now, or as awake as it will be before the sun clears the horizon. It is a world of extraordinary physical immediacy, every sensation unmediated, every comfort earned, every morning a small negotiation with cold and darkness and the limits of what human hands can do without the assistance of the centuries of invention that have not yet arrived. The people moving through it do not experience it as deprivation. They experience it as life, the only life they know, the life their parents knew, and their grandparents before them, stretching back through generations of cold mornings and smoky rooms and frozen wells, and the bell of the church calling the day into being. They are not waiting for a better world. They are living in the one they have with a competence and a resilience that the warmth of a modern room makes very difficult to fully imagine. The frost on the thatch is beginning, just barely, to soften at its edges. The sky to the east has shifted from black to a deep, bruised grey. Somewhere in the village, a child is crying, and somewhere else, a dog is barking at something in the dark beyond the fence. The smell of wood smoke is everywhere now, rising from every cottage, drifting across the frozen fields, carrying with it the particular warmth of a world that has made its fire and begun its day. The cold stone church stands at the center of it all, its bell silent now, its door closed against the cold, its interior dark except for the single candle burning before the altar. A small, steady flame that has been burning through the night and will burn through the day, the one light in the village that never goes out. This is where the day begins. In the cold and the dark and the smoke and the slow return of warmth to a room that has spent the night surrendering it, in the sound of a bell and the smell of a fire and the weight of a wool blanket being folded back from a body that must now rise and meet the world. In 1356, in a village in England, on a morning that is indistinguishable from 1,000 mornings before it, and 1,000 mornings still to come, the day has been called. The day has been called. The fire has been lit. The world, such as it is, has begun. The fire has been burning for perhaps an hour now, and the room holds a thin, precarious warmth that does not reach the corners, that does not reach the corners. The woman of the household moves to the wooden basin near the door, a shallow vessel, roughly hewn, its interior stained dark from years of use, and ladles into it a small measure of water from the bucket. The water is cold. There is no other kind available at this hour, not without the considerable effort of heating a pot over the fire, and the morning's tasks will not wait for that luxury. She takes the coarse linen cloth that hangs from a peg beside the basin and dips it, wrings it, and draws it across her face with the practiced efficiency of someone performing a ritual so familiar it requires no thought. Hands next, the cloth again, and then the cloth is hung back on its peg, and the washing is done, and the day proceeds. This is the morning ablution of 1356, and it is not nothing. It is easy, from the distance of centuries, to look at this brief, cold, waterless routine and see only absence, the absence of soap, of hot water, of the long shower that a modern person considers not a luxury, but a baseline requirement of being human. But to see only absence is to misread the world entirely. The people of medieval England had their own understanding of cleanliness, their own logic of the body and its care, and that logic was not born of ignorance alone, but of a coherent, if profoundly mistaken, medical framework that shaped every decision about water and skin and the relationship between the two. The medical authorities of the 14th century, the physicians trained in the traditions of Galen and Avicenna, whose texts circulated in the monasteries and universities of Europe, taught that the human body was a system of humors, 4 essential fluids whose balance determined health and whose disruption caused disease. Hot water, in this framework, was genuinely dangerous. It opened the pores of the skin, and an open pore was not a breathing passage, but a breach, a gap in the body's defenses through which the miasma, the pestilential air believed to carry disease, could enter and corrupt the blood. The Black Death had swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing perhaps a third of the population, and its memory in 1356 was not historical but immediate, a wound still raw, a fear still present in every household and every prayer. In the aftermath of that catastrophe, the advice to avoid hot baths was not superstition. It was the best medical thinking of the age, applied with desperate seriousness to the problem of survival. And so a layer of grime was understood not as filth, but as protection. The skin's natural oils, the accumulated residue of days without washing, formed a seal, a biological armor against the invisible enemies that moved through the air and sought entry through the body's surfaces. To scrub that seal away with hot water and harsh soap was in the understanding of the time, to invite death in through the front door. This is not a comfortable thought for a modern mind to hold, but it is an important one, because it transforms the picture entirely. The medieval person who did not bathe was not lazy or indifferent. They were, by their own lights, being careful. They were following the best available guidance. They were trying to survive. For those of higher station, the nobility, the wealthy merchants, the senior clergy, there was an alternative system of cleanliness that required no dangerous water at all. It was built around linen. The linen undershift, worn directly against the skin, was understood to function as a kind of biological filter, drawing the impurities and toxins out through the pores and locking them into the fabric, effectively cleaning the body from the outside in. A nobleman might change his linen undershift 3 or 4 times in a single day, each fresh garment carrying away the accumulated impurities of the hours before. The shirt was laundered regularly, beaten against stones in a stream, soaked in lye made from wood ash and water, rinsed and dried in the air, and its whiteness was not merely aesthetic, but medical. A bright white linen shirt, its collar and cuffs visible at the edges of a wool coat or velvet surcoat, was a public declaration of cleanliness, of wealth, of the capacity to be clean without the dangerous intervention of water. It was a status symbol written in fabric, legible to every person who saw it. The peasant had linen too, though of a coarser weave, and in smaller quantity. The basic garment of the medieval body, for men and women alike, across most of the social spectrum, was the undershift, a loose garment of undyed linen worn next to the skin, reaching to the knee or below, changed and washed far more frequently than the heavy wool garments worn over it. The outer clothing, the wool tunic belted with rope or leather, the rough cloak against the cold, the coif or veil covering the head, might go weeks or months without washing, because wool is difficult to clean and slow to dry, and loses its shape when handled roughly with water. But the linen beneath it was the layer that mattered, the layer that touched the skin, and it was attended to with more care than the outer garments suggest. The smell of the medieval body is something that requires honest acknowledgement, though not the dramatic revulsion that popular imagination tends to supply. It was real, and it was present, and it was layered. Beneath the linen, the skin carried the natural musk of a body that had not met water in some days, not the sharp, acrid smell of acute exertion, but the deeper, more complex smell of accumulated warmth and oil and the particular chemistry of human skin living in close quarters with wool and smoke in animals. The wool itself had its own smell, lanolin, and damp, and the faint ghost of the sheep it had come from, a smell that intensified in rain or near a fire. The rushes on the floor released their own scent when walked upon, the dried herbs among them giving brief, sweet counterpoint to the earthier notes of the room. Tallow candles, rendered from animal fat, burned with a soft, slightly rancid smoke that settled into clothing and hair. The animals in the corner contributed their own warm, grassy presence to the atmosphere. Against all of this, the medieval world deployed its own arsenal of fragrance. Rosewater was distilled and applied to the skin and hair. Musk and spices, those that could be obtained, which meant those wealthy enough to access the trade routes that brought them from the east, were worked into pomanders and sachets, carried close to the body. Lavender and rosemary were strewn among the rushes and hung in bundles from the rafters. The wealthy applied these remedies more liberally and more expensively than the poor, but the impulse was universal, to place something pleasant between the nose and the biological reality of a world without running water. This was not deception. It was the available technology of comfort, applied with as much ingenuity as the circumstances allowed. Hair presented its own particular logic. For women, the hair was almost always covered by the linen coif worn indoors, by the veil worn in public, by the more elaborate headdresses of those with the means and the occasion to wear them. This covering was partly modesty, partly social convention, and partly practical hygiene in the medieval sense. Keeping the hair contained reduced the spread of lice, reduced the exposure to the smoky air of the room, and reduced the frequency with which washing was required. When hair was washed, it was done with water, and sometimes with a preparation of wood ash lye or the juice of certain plants. Saponaria, the soapwort, whose crushed leaves produce a mild lather, but this was an infrequent event, not a daily one. Between washings, the hair was combed carefully and regularly, oiled to keep it smooth and to discourage the parasites that were a constant presence in a world of shared beds and close quarters. The comb was one of the most personal objects a medieval person owned, often carved from bone or wood, sometimes from ivory, for those of means, and its use was a daily ritual of care that required no water at all. Teeth were another matter entirely. The medieval mouth was a landscape of considerable difficulty, not because its inhabitants were indifferent to it, but because the tools available for its care were crude, and the understanding of what caused decay was entirely wrong. The toothworm was the accepted explanation for the pain of a rotting tooth, a small creature believed to gnaw at the root from within, causing the throbbing agony that could make a person unable to eat or sleep. Against this imagined enemy, the available remedies were applied with genuine desperation. Rough linen cloths, dipped in mixtures of ground salt, crushed bone, and herbs were used to scour the teeth, scraping at the yellowing surface with an abrasiveness that cleaned somewhat, but also damaged the enamel over time. Herbal preparations were held in the mouth to numb the pain, and when the pain became unbearable, when the tooth had rotted beyond any remedy, the barber surgeon was called. The extraction was performed without anesthesia, with a pair of pliers or a specialized tool called a pelican, and the experience was sufficiently terrible that it was avoided until absolutely necessary, which meant that many medieval mouths contained teeth in various stages of decay, alongside gaps where teeth had been. The wooden tub existed, and it was used, though not with the frequency that modern imagination might hope. In the great households, bathing was a more elaborate affair, a large wooden tub lined with linen to prevent splinters, filled with water heated over the kitchen fire and carried in buckets to the chamber, sometimes scented with herbs or rose petals, sometimes shared sequentially by members of the household in order of their rank. The public bathhouses that existed in many medieval towns, the stews, as they were sometimes called, offered hot baths for a fee, and were used by those who could afford them, though their reputation was complicated by their association with other transactions of a less hygienic nature. For the peasant family in their single room, The wooden tub was a seasonal event at best, perhaps before a feast day, perhaps after the harvest, perhaps when illness or circumstance made it seem worth the considerable effort of heating enough water to fill it. The garderobe in the castle or the manor house was the architectural solution to the problem of bodily waste, a stone chamber built into the thickness of the fincas of the Bergen Verfeerti, wall its seat a stone bench with a hole that opened onto a shaft, dropping to a pit or a moat far below. The name, meaning wardrobe, was not accidental. The finest clothing of the household was often stored in this chamber because the rising fumes from the waste below, concentrated ammonia and other compounds, were understood to kill the moths and fleas that plagued expensive fabrics. The toilet was the fumigation chamber, and the logic, however unpleasant to contemplate, was sound. To the peasant, the arrangement was simpler and more exposed, a pit dug at the edge of the yard, covered with a wooden board, visited in all weathers and all seasons, offering no privacy and no comfort beyond the basic function it served. In the absence of paper, a material that was rare, expensive, and reserved for writing, the act of cleaning oneself after use of the garderobe or the pit relied on whatever the immediate environment provided. Moss was common, gathered from the banks of streams and stored in the garderobe for the purpose. Hay and straw were used in the fields and the barns, broad leaves in summer, scraps of worn linen too degraded for clothing, repurposed for this final function before being discarded. The wealthy might use soft wool. The very wealthy might use dedicated cloths of fine linen. But for most people, most of the time, the solution was whatever was at hand, and its effectiveness was limited, and the biological consequences of that limitation were felt throughout the body and throughout the community. And yet, and this is the observation that the medieval world insists upon if one looks at it with sufficient patience, there was care here. There was attention. There was a daily ritual of the basin and the cloth, a regular practice of combing and covering and changing the linen nearest the skin. There was the application of rosewater and the strewing of herbs and the careful maintenance of the one garment that touched the body directly. Medieval people were not indifferent to cleanliness. They were working within a framework of understanding that was wrong in its foundations, but coherent in its applications. Doing what they believed was right and healthy and proper with the materials and the knowledge available to them. The gap between their world and ours is not a gap of caring. It is a gap of infrastructure, of knowledge, of the slow accumulation of understanding that would eventually produce the germ theory of disease and the municipal water supply and the hot shower that runs at the turn of a handle. That accumulation had not yet happened, but the desire for it, the human desire to be clean, to be well, to be free of pain and parasites, and the smell of one's own unwashed skin, that desire was entirely present, entirely recognizable, entirely theirs. The basin by the door holds its cold water still. The linen cloth hangs on its peg, damp and cooling in the morning air. The fire burns on, and the room smells of smoke and herbs and the particular warmth of bodies that have spent the night beneath wool blankets and are now moving through their day. It is a smell that is gone from the world now, as completely as the world that produced it. But it was real, and it was inhabited, and the people who lived within it were as fully human as any person who has ever stood beneath a hot shower and felt the water run clean. The iron pot has been hanging above the fire since before the first light entered the room. It is a heavy thing, black with years of use, its surface rough with the accumulated residue of 1,000 meals, suspended from a hook on an iron chain that allows it to be raised or lowered over the flames depending on what the cooking requires. Inside it, something is moving, a slow, thick movement, the barely perceptible turning of a liquid that is not quite liquid, that has been simmering since yesterday's remnants were added to this morning's water and set back over the heat before the family had fully woken. The smell it produces fills the room completely. Earth, verdure, warm, faintly sweet from the onions that dissolved into it hours ago, underlaid with the deeper, more mineral smell of barley swelling in the heat. This is pottage. This is pottage. This is, for the overwhelming majority of people alive in 1356, the central fact of eating. The kitchen of a peasant household is not a separate room. It is the room. The same room where the family sleeps and works and shelters from the cold, organized around the hearth that serves simultaneously as furnace, stove, and the primary source of light after dark. The cooking equipment is minimal and precious. The iron pot, which represents a significant investment and is passed down through generations. A long-handled wooden spoon, worn smooth from use. A small iron trivet for setting vessels near the heat without placing them directly in the flame. A clay pot for storing the rendered fat that serves as both cooking medium and lamp fuel. This Starking, rough-hewn table against the wall holds the wooden bowls, one for each member of the family, or perhaps shared between two, and the horn spoons that will be used to eat with, and the round loaf of dark bread that was baked 2 days ago and is already beginning to harden at its crust. There are no plates in the modern sense. There are no forks. There is the spoon, and there is the bread, and there is the bowl, and these 3 objects constitute the entire apparatus of a meal. Pottage is not a single dish. It is a category, a method, a philosophy of cooking, shaped entirely by the constraints of the hearth and the season and the contents of the storage pit. At its most basic, it is grain, barley, oats, or the coarser rye, boiled in water until it thickens into something between a porridge and a stew, seasoned with salt if salt is available, with dried herbs from the rafters, with whatever vegetables the kitchen garden has yielded or the storage cellar still holds. In summer and early autumn, when the garden is producing, the pot receives leeks and cabbages and turnips, onions and garlic and the broad beans that are one of the primary sources of protein for people who rarely see meat. In the lean months of late winter, when the stored vegetables have been consumed and the new growth has not yet begun, the pottage thins and darkens and tastes primarily of grain and salt and the memory of better days. It is eaten hot from the bowl, morning and evening, day after day, week after week, with a monotony that a modern palate would find difficult to sustain, but that the medieval body accepts as simply the texture of nourishment. The grain that goes into the pot begins its life in the strip fields that stretch beyond the village in long narrow ribbons of cultivated earth. The open field system that organizes agricultural life in 1356 divides the land around the village into 2 or 3 great fields, each field subdivided into strips roughly a furlong in length, the distance an ox can plough before needing to rest, and each family in the village holds strips scattered across the fields rather than consolidated in a single plot. This arrangement is not accidental. It distributes the risk of bad soil and poor drainage across the community, ensuring that no single family bears the full burden of a failed strip, while another prospers. It is a system of collective survival, built over generations of experience, with the unpredictability of weather and soil and the catastrophic consequences of a failed harvest. The crops grown in these fields are not the crops of a modern farm. There are no potatoes. That vegetable will not arrive in Europe for another 2 centuries, carried back from the Americas that have not yet been reached. There are no tomatoes, no peppers, no maize. The grains are rye and barley, and oats, hardier and less demanding than wheat, better suited to the heavy clay soils and the uncertain English climate. Wheat is grown where the soil allows, but the white bread, made from wheat flour, is a luxury that marks social distance as clearly as the linen shirt. The Lord eats white manchet bread, fine-grained and soft, while the peasant eats maslin, a dark loaf made from a mixture of rye and wheat, or darker still, a bread of pure rye that is dense and slightly sour and keeps longer than the finer loaves. The canso. The bread is not merely food. It is also, in the absence of plates, a vessel, the thick round trencher of stale bread that serves as a plate at more formal meals, absorbing the juices of whatever is placed upon it, eaten last, or given to the poor, or fed to the dogs, depending on the household circumstances. Beside the cottage, the kitchen garden holds the vegetables that give the pottage its variation and its nutrition. It is a small, intensively worked plot, every inch of it productive, organized with the practical knowledge of people who understand exactly what each plant contributes to the survival of the household. Leeks are the great staple, hardy, storing well into winter, flavoring the pot with their mild sweetness through the coldest months. Onions and garlic are present in nearly every garden, their pungent chemistry understood intuitively, if not scientifically, as having some protective quality against illness. Cabbages and kale, their broad leaves surviving frost that kills more tender plants. Parsnips and turnips, their roots storing energy in the cold ground through winter. Peas and beans in summer, dried and stored for winter use. And among the vegetables, the herbs, parsley and sage, thyme and hyssop, tansy and lovage, grown for cooking and for medicine, in a world that does not distinguish sharply between the two. The garden is tended primarily by women worked in the margins of time between the other tasks that fill every waking hour, and its productivity is a direct measure of the household's resilience against the hunger that is never entirely absent from the calculation of daily life. Bread is baked communally. In most villages, in the Lord's oven, a large domed structure of clay or stone that can be heated to a temperature no domestic hearth can achieve, capable of baking the large round loaves that will last a family for several days. The use of the communal oven is not free. It is a service rendered by the Lord to the village, and it is paid for in kind, a portion of each baking given to the Lord's household as a fee, daking, given to the Lord's household as a fee, a small but regular transfer of resources that is one of the many ways the feudal system extracts its toll from the labor of the peasant. The baking day is a social event of sorts, women gathering with their shaped loaves, waiting for the oven to reach the right heat, tested by throwing a handful of flour inside and watching how quickly it browns, loading the loaves with long-handled wooden paddles, waiting in the warmth and the smell of baking bread for the transformation that turns raw dough into the staff of life. The smell of bread baking is one of the great constants of human experience, and in 1356 it is not background but foreground, a significant event in the week, anticipated and appreciated with a directness that abundance has since made difficult. Meat is present in the medieval diet, but not reliably and not abundantly for most people. The peasant household might keep a pig, fed on kitchen scraps through the year, and slaughtered in November when the cold makes preservation possible, the carcass salted and hung, providing protein through the winter months in the form of salt pork that flavors the pottage and is eaten sparingly, stretched as far as it will go. Chickens provide eggs more reliably than they provide meat. A cow or a goat gives milk, some of which is made into cheese, a hard, sharp cheese that keeps through the winter and supplements the grain-heavy diet with fat and protein. Fish, where it could be obtained, was preserved by salting or drying and was particularly important during the many fast days of the church calendar, when meat was forbidden and fish was the acceptable substitute. The smell of dried salt fish, sharp, penetrating, unmistakable, was a constant presence in the stores of any household that could obtain it, and its taste, reconstituted in the pottage pot with water and herbs, was the taste of Lent and of Friday, and of the approximately half the days of the year when the Church's dietary rules prohibited the eating of flesh. The church calendar shapes the rhythm of eating as completely as the agricultural calendar shapes the rhythm of labor. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, is a period of genuine austerity, not merely symbolic abstinence. Meat, eggs, and dairy are all forbidden, and the diet narrows to fish, bread, and the pottage of dried legumes and grain that the Lenten season demands. The fast days scattered through the rest of the year, Fridays, Saturdays, the vigils of major feasts, add up to something approaching half the days of the calendar year on which the full range of foods is not available. This is not experienced as deprivation in the modern sense, because it is simply the structure of the year, as fixed and as expected as the seasons themselves. And the feast days that punctuate the fasting are genuinely festive. Christmas and Easter and the great saints' days bring the community together around food that is richer and more varied than the daily pottage. And the contrast between feast and fast gives each its meaning, the pleasure of abundance sharpened by the memory of restraint. What is entirely absent from the medieval diet is worth pausing to consider, because the absences shape the cuisine as much as the presences. There is no sugar in the peasant household. Sugar is an exotic spice, traded from the East at enormous expense, available only to the very wealthy and used in tiny quantities as a medicine and a flavoring rather than a sweetener in the modern sense. Honey is the sweetener of the medieval world, produced in hives kept by monasteries and by those households wealthy enough to maintain them, used sparingly and valued highly. There is no coffee, no tea. Those beverages belong to trade routes and centuries that have not yet opened. The drink of the medieval world, for almost everyone, is ale, brewed from malted grain, lightly fermented, consumed in quantities that seem alarming until one understands that the water available from wells and streams is genuinely dangerous, contaminated with the waste of animals and humans alike, and that the mild alcohol of ale renders it safer to drink than the water it was brewed from. Children drink ale, the elderly drink ale. It is not intoxication that is sought, but hydration, the basic human need for liquid met through the one available medium that will not reliably make the drinker ill. The great hall of a manor or castle presents a vision of medieval eating that is entirely different from the peasant cottage, and the difference is not merely one of quantity but of kind. The Lord's table is set with white bread and roasted meats, beef and pork and venison from the Lord's forest, where the peasant may not hunt on pain of severe punishment. There are spiced sauces, their complexity a demonstration of access to the pepper and ginger and cinnamon that travel from the East along trade routes of extraordinary length and expense. There is wine, imported from France or the Rhine, poured into pewter cups, for the Lord and his guests, while the servants at the lower tables drink ale from wooden vessels. The hierarchy of the feast is the hierarchy of the society, made edible and visible. The white bread at the high table, the dark bread at the lower tables, the spiced meat above, the plain pottage below, the wine at the center, the ale at the margins. Every person in the hall knows exactly where they stand in the order of things, and the food placed before them is the confirmation of that knowledge, repeated at every meal, as legible as any written document. Back in the cottage, the pottage has thickened to the right consistency. The woman of the household ladles it into the wooden bowls, sets the dark bread beside them, calls the children from their tasks. The family gathers at the rough table, standing or sitting on low stools, and the meal begins without ceremony. There is no ceremony available, no time for it, no energy to spare for it. The spoons move from bowl to mouth in the rhythm of hunger being addressed. the bread torn and used to wipe the bowl clean at the end. Nothing wasted, nothing left, the pot scraped and set back over the fire with fresh water already added for the evening's meal. The taste of the pottage is simple and deep. The sweetness of the onion, the earthiness of the barley, the faint bitterness of the dried herbs, the salt that is the one flavoring that cannot be substituted or omitted, the mineral foundation on which everything else rests. It is not a meal that would satisfy a modern appetite accustomed to variety and contrast and the stimulation of sugar and fat and the 100 flavors that global trade and industrial agriculture have made available at every hour of Raya, every day. But it is food, real food, grown in the earth a few 100 yards from where it is eaten, prepared with knowledge and care over a fire that has been burning since before dawn, shared among people who understand its value in the most direct possible way. Not as pleasure, primarily, though pleasure is present in the warmth of it, the filling of an empty stomach, the brief pause in the labor of the day, but as the fuel that makes everything else possible. The pottage sustains the arm that swings the scythe, and the back that bends over the loom, and the legs that carry the water from the well. It is the foundation of the entire world, this thick, dark, earthy substance in a wooden bowl, and the people who eat it know that with a certainty that no abundance can teach. The fire burns on beneath the iron pot. The smell of the morning's cooking lingers in the room through the afternoon, absorbed into the rushes on the floor and the wool of the hanging clothing and the rough surface of the door walls, becoming part of the room's particular atmosphere, indistinguishable eventually from the smell of the room itself. Outside, the kitchen garden holds its rows of leeks and cabbages against the cold, patient and productive, the result of generations of accumulated knowledge about what grows and what nourishes and what keeps through the winter. The strip fields beyond the village boundary lie quiet in the pale light, waiting for the spring ploughing that is still months away. And in the great hall of the manor, the Lord's table is being laid for the midday meal, the white bread set at the high table, the ale poured into the lower vessels, the entire social order arranged once more in the language of food, as it has been arranged every day of every year that anyone alive in 1356 can remember. Beyond the last cottage, beyond the kitchen gardens, and the animal pens, and the midden heaps, at the edge of the yard, the land opens. It opens in a way that a modern eye, accustomed to the enclosed fields and hedgerows of a later agricultural era, would find startling, a vast, unbroken expanse of cultivated earth, stretching to a pale horizon, divided not by fences or walls, but by the subtle geography of the ridge and furrow pattern pressed into the soil by generations of ploughing. The strips run long and narrow, each one a furlong in length, their edges marked by the slight rise of unploughed headland where the ox team turned at the end of each pass. From a distance, in the low light of a winter morning, the fields have the texture of corduroy, parallel ridges of dark earth alternating with shallow furrows, the accumulated record of every plough that has moved through this soil since the village was first settled, perhaps 2 centuries ago, perhaps 3. This is the open field system, and it is the physical foundation upon which the entire world of 1356 rests. The organization of these fields is a communal achievement of considerable complexity. Each family in the village holds not a single consolidated plot, but a scattering of strips, distributed across 2 or 3 great fields, perhaps 30 strips in total for a prosperous villein, fewer for a cottager with less land, more for the rare freeholder whose circumstances allow it. The distribution is deliberate, the product of long negotiation, an inherited custom designed to ensure that the good soil and the poor soil, the well-drained high ground and the waterlogged low ground are shared across the community rather than concentrated in any single pair of hands. It is a system that sacrifices individual efficiency for collective resilience, and in a world where a single bad harvest can mean starvation, resilience is worth more than efficiency. The agricultural year begins in earnest with the spring ploughing, and the ploughing begins with the ox. The ox is not a romantic figure in this world. It is a tool, the most important tool the village possesses, its value exceeding that of any other single object in the peasant's inventory. A full plough team requires 8 oxen, a number that almost no single family can provide, and so the ploughing is done communally, neighbors pooling their animals, sharing the labor, dew falling, their animals, sharing the labor, working the strips in sequence according to arrangements that have been established by custom and renegotiated each season as circumstances change. The plough itself is a heavy wooden structure, its share tipped with iron, its beam worn smooth by the hands that have guided it across this soil for years, to hold a plough steady through a furlong of heavy clay, to keep the share at the right depth, to manage the ox team with voice and goad while maintaining the line. This is skilled physical labor, demanding strength and knowledge, and the particular attentiveness that comes from understanding the soil beneath one's feet as intimately as one understands the members of one's own household. The smell of turned earth in spring is one of the most specific and irreplaceable sensory experiences the agricultural world offers. It rises from the broken soil in a complex wave, dark and mineral, faintly sweet, carrying within it the smell of decomposition and renewal, simultaneously the smell of last year's roots breaking down into the substance that will feed this year's grain. The ploughman moves through this smell for hours, his boots sinking into the soft earth, at the furrow's edge, his hands on the plough beam transmitting every stone and root and change in soil texture directly to his arms and shoulders. By midday, his back has settled into a particular ache that is not quite pain. It is too familiar for that, too expected, too much a part of the day's texture to register as anything other than the feeling of work being done. Behind him, the turned earth lies dark and open to the sky, and the rooks that have been following the plough all morning descend into the fresh furrow to take the worms and grubs that the share has exposed, their black shapes moving through the brown earth with the unhurried confidence of creatures who know that the plough always comes and the worms always follow. Summer brings a different quality of labor, less concentrated than the ploughing, more continuous, spread across the long days that the northern latitude provides in June and July. The grain must be weeded, the kitchen garden tended, the hay meadows mown, and turned and gathered before the rain comes and ruins what the sun has dried. The haymaking is communal work, the whole village turning out to the meadows with their wooden-handled scythes and their wooden rakes, moving through the long grass in a rhythm that is almost musical, the sweep of the scythe, the whisper of the falling grass, the pause to wet the blade with a stone carried in a leather pouch at the hip. The smell of cut hay is sweet and slightly dusty, and it fills the air of the meadow on a warm July afternoon with a richness that is one of the few genuinely pleasant sensory experiences the agricultural year reliably provides. The hay is gathered into cocks and left to dry, then loaded onto carts and carried to the barn, where it will sustain the animals through the winter months when the fields offer nothing. The harvest in August and September is the axis around which the entire year turns. Everything that has been done since the spring ploughing, the sowing, the weeding, the tending, the praying for rain, and then for sun, and then for the right balance of both, has been directed toward this moment, and the moment is as physically demanding as anything the agricultural year contains. The grain is cut with sickles, the curved iron blade drawing through the stalks in a motion that must be repeated thousands of times across the length of a strip. The cut stalks gathered into sheaves and bound with a twist of straw, the sheaves propped against each other in stooks to dry in the field, before being carted to the threshing floor. The work goes on from first light to last. Every able body in the village pressed into service, because the window between ripeness and rain is narrow and the consequences of missing it are catastrophic. Children who are old enough to carry a sheaf carry sheaves. The elderly who can no longer swing a sickle glean behind the harvesters, picking up the fallen stalks that the sickle has missed, a right enshrined in custom and in Scripture, the margin of survival for those too old or too weak to participate in the main harvest. The threshing floor is where the grain is separated from the stalk, and it is work of a particular grinding monotony. The sheaves are spread on the hard-packed earth of the barn floor and beaten with flails. Two wooden rods, joined by a leather hinge, swung in a continuous arc that strikes the grain from the ear with each pass. The sound of flailing fills the barn with a rhythmic percussion, the crack of wood against straw repeated over and over in the cold air of October and November, the chaff rising in clouds that settle into the hair and clothing and lungs of the workers, the grain accumulating in a pile on the floor, to be winnowed, tossed into the air, so that the wind carries the chaff away, and the heavier grain falls back to the ground. The smell of the threshing floor is dry and dusty and slightly sweet, the smell of the year's labor reduced to its essential product, the grain that will be ground into flour and baked into bread and boiled into pottage and kept as seed for next year's planting, the grain that is, in the most literal sense, the difference between life and death for every person in the village. The millstone grinds that grain into flour, and the mill, whether powered by water or by wind, is another of the Lord's monopolies, another of the mechanisms by which the feudal system extracts its portion from the labor of those below. The miller takes his toll, a portion of each grinding paid in flour, and the peasant family carries home what remains, a sack of dark, slightly gritty flour that will be made into the bread that sustains them through the months ahead. The grit in the flour is not an impurity exactly. It is the stone itself, worn from the millstone by the grinding, incorporated into the flour, and then into the bread, and then into the teeth of everyone who eats it, contributing over years to the characteristic wear visible in the skulls of medieval people. The molars ground flat by a lifetime of bread made from stone-ground grain. The village contains other labor environments beyond the fields, each with its own particular sensory signature. The blacksmith's forge stands near the center of the village, its fire burning hotter than any domestic hearth. Its bellows driven by a leather mechanism that sends a roar of air into the coals and raises them to the white heat needed to work iron. The smith moves through a world of heat and noise, the hammer ringing against the anvil with a sound that carries across the village, the hiss of hot metal plunged into the water trough to temper it, the smell of hot iron and coal smoke, and the particular sharp scent of metal being shaped. He makes and repairs the tools that the agricultural world depends upon. The ploughshares, the sickle blades, the horseshoes, the hinges and hooks and nails that hold the physical infrastructure of the village together. Without him, the fields cannot be ploughed and the harvest cannot be cut, and his skill is understood and valued accordingly. The tanner's pit, at the edge of the village where the smell will carry away from the dwellings rather than toward them, is one of the most unpleasant working environments the medieval world contains. The process of turning raw animal hide into usable leather requires the hide to be soaked in a series of increasingly potent solutions, first in water to soften it, then in a preparation of urine and dung to remove the hair, then in a tannin solution made from oak bark that slowly transforms the hide into leather over a period of months. The smell of the tanner's yard is acrid and penetrating, a combination of decomposing organic matter and the sharp chemical bite of the tanning solutions, and it announces itself from a considerable distance. The tanner himself is identifiable by the smell that has permeated his clothing and his skin, a smell that no amount of washing, had washing been more common, could entirely remove. Yet the leather he produces is essential, the boots and shoes, the harness and straps, the bags and scabbards that the village requires, all of it beginning in that malodorous pit, transformed by patience and chemistry into something durable and useful. The weaver's cottage holds a different atmosphere entirely, quieter, more enclosed, the rhythmic clatter of the loom filling the room with a sound that is almost meditative in its regularity. The loom is a large wooden structure that occupies much of the available floor space, its warp threads stretched taut between the beams, the shuttle carrying the weft thread back and forth through the shed in a motion that the weaver's hands perform with the automatic precision of long practice. The cloth produced on this loom is the wool that clothes the village, undyed and rough, for everyday wear, sometimes dyed with weld or wode or madder for those who can afford the additional labor and expense of color. The weaver's fingers, by middle age, carry the marks of the work, calloused at the tips, slightly bent from the constant tension of handling thread, the skin roughened by the lanolin of the raw wool, and the sizing applied to the warp threads to strengthen them for weaving. What unites all of these labor environments, the field, the forge, the tanner's pit, the weaver's cottage, is the complete absence of any mechanism that reduces the physical demand on the human body. There is no engine, no motor, no device that multiplies force beyond what human muscle and animal strength can provide. Every nail driven, every furrow turned, every sheaf cut and bound and cotted, every hide soaked and scraped and stretched, all of it is accomplished by the direct application of human effort, sustained over hours and days and seasons and years, wearing the body down with a thoroughness that leaves its record in the bones. Medieval skeletons tell this story plainly. The vertebrae compressed by years of carrying heavy loads, the joints worn by repetitive motion, the muscle attachment points enlarged by the constant demands placed upon them, the body of a medieval agricultural laborer. At 40 is the body of someone who has spent 40 years in a negotiation with physical reality that has no respite and no retirement. And yet the work continues because it must, because the alternative to work in this world is not leisure but hunger, not rest but the slow diminishment of everything that sustains life. The late winter months, January and February, when the stored grain is running low and the new growth has not yet begun and the fields lie frozen and unworkable, are the lean time. The time when the calculation of survival becomes most visible and most urgent. The pottage thins. The bread is made from the older grain, the grain that has been in storage longest, that may have begun to mold or to harbor the ergot fungus that causes convulsions and hallucinations and insufficient quantities, death. The animals are thin too, surviving on the hay that was cut in July and stored in the barn, their milk production reduced, their bodies drawing on reserves that the summer's grazing built up and the winter's cold is slowly consuming. The village in February is a place of careful rationing and quiet anxiety, the community holding its collective breath until the first signs of spring, the lengthening of the days, the softening of the ground, the appearance of the first green shoots in the kitchen garden signal that the year has turned and the cycle of labor can begin again. The ridge and furrow of the open fields holds the memory of all this labor in its very shape. Each ridge is the accumulated result of years of plowing in the same direction, the soil thrown always to the center of the strip, building up over decades into a low scent, building up over decades into a low, permanent wave of earth that will outlast the people who made it by centuries. In some parts of England, these patterns are still visible from the air, the ghost of the medieval field system pressed into the landscape, legible to those who know how to read it, a record written not in ink, but in earth, by the hands and the animals, and the wooden ploughs of people who could not have imagined that their labor would leave a mark lasting longer than any document they ever touched. The healer's cottage announces itself before it can be seen. The smell reaches the lane first, a dense, layered fragrance that is part garden and part apothecary and part something older than either, a smell compounded of dried rosemary and wormwood, of feverfew and yarrow, of the sharp medicinal bite of wormwood hanging in bundles from the low rafters alongside the sweeter notes of dried lavender and chamomile. Step through the low doorway and the eyes adjust slowly to the interior dimness, and what they find is a room that seems, at first, to be made entirely of plants. Every beam holds its bundles. Every hook bears its cluster of dried stems and seed heads. The walls are lined with clay pots and wooden boxes and small linen bags tied at the neck, each one containing something gathered from the hedgerow or the monastery garden or the damp ground beside the stream, each one representing a piece of knowledge accumulated over a lifetime of watching what the body does when it is given certain things and what it does when it is not. This is the environment of healing in 1356, and it is not nothing. It would be easy and wrong to look at this cottage and see only the absence of what will eventually replace it, the absence of antibiotics, of surgical anesthesia, of the germ theory of disease that will not arrive for another 5 centuries. What is present here is a tradition of plant knowledge that is genuinely sophisticated within its own framework, accumulated across generations of careful observation, encoded in manuscripts, copied in monastery scriptoria, and passed down through the oral traditions of village healers whose names were never written anywhere. The healer, most often a woman in the village context, though the formal medical authorities of the universities were exclusively male, knows which plants reduce fever and which ease the cramping of the gut, and which, applied as a poultice to a wound, seem to prevent the corruption that turns a cut into a death sentence. She does not know why these things work, but she knows with considerable precision that they do. The medical framework within which all healing in 1356 operates is the theory of the 4 humours, inherited from the ancient world through the writings of Galen and transmitted through centuries of scholarly commentary into the medical practice of the 14th century. The body, in this understanding, is governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose proper balance constitutes health and whose disruption constitutes disease. Each humour is associated with a season, a temperature, a quality. Blood is hot and moist, associated with spring and air. Phlegm is cold and moist, associated with winter and water. Yellow bile is hot and dry, associated with summer and fire. Black bile is cold and dry, associated with autumn and earth. Illness is an imbalance, and treatment is the restoration of balance through diet, through purging, through bloodletting, through the administration of herbs whose own qualities of heat and cold and moisture and dryness can counteract the excess or deficiency that the illness represents. This framework is wrong in its foundations. It has no relationship to the actual mechanisms of disease, but it is internally coherent, and it provides a rational basis for treatment that is more than mere superstition, even if the treatments it prescribes are often ineffective and sometimes actively harmful. Bloodletting is perhaps the most characteristic medical intervention of the medieval world, and it is practiced with a confidence that its results do not justify. The barber surgeon, the same figure who pulls the rotting tooth and sets the broken bone, opens a vein with a small blade called a lancet and allows a measured quantity of blood to flow into a bowl. The quantity and the location of the cut determined by the nature of the illness and the astrological calendar that governs which parts of the body are under the influence of which signs on which days. The patient, already weakened by illness, is weakened further by the loss of blood, and in many cases the treatment accelerates the decline it is intended to reverse. But the theory demands it, and the theory is all there is, and the barber surgeon applies it with the genuine intention of helping, which is perhaps the most important thing to understand about medieval medicine. It is not cruelty, but the best available knowledge, applied in good faith to suffering that it cannot adequately address. The shadow that falls across every act of healing in 1356 is the shadow of the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, the plague swept through Europe with a speed and a just lethality that had no precedent in living memory or recorded history. It killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, roughly a third of Europe's entire population, in the space of 4 years. In 1356, that catastrophe is not history. It is recent memory, still raw, still present in the empty cottages that stand in some villages with their doors hanging open, their families gone, their gardens gone, to weed. It is present in the churchyards, where the graves are crowded, close together, the markers simple and sometimes absent, the ground still slightly raised, where the mass burials were made in the worst years. It is present in the prayers that are said each morning and each evening, in the particular intensity with which the candles are lit before the saints whose intercession is sought against the return of the pestilence, in the way that a cough in a crowded room can still produce a silence that has fear in it. The plague doctors who moved through the infected cities during the worst years of the outbreak were figures of genuine terror and genuine courage simultaneously. Their characteristic costume, the long waxed coat, the wide-brimmed hat, the gloves, and above all the beaked mask filled with aromatic herbs and spices, was not theatrical but functional, designed according to the miasma theory that understood disease as carried in corrupted air. The beak was a filter, its contents of lavender and camphor and vinegar-soaked sponge intended to purify the air before it reached the physician's lungs. The theory was wrong. The plague was carried by the fleas of infected rats, a mechanism entirely invisible to medieval understanding. But the theory, costume's insistence on creating a barrier between the physician and the patient, had some practical value. even if not for the reasons its designers believed. The physicians who wore it and entered the plague houses were not fools. They were brave people working at the absolute limit of what their knowledge allowed, in the presence of a disease that killed the healthy as readily as the weak. The monastery infirmary represents the most organized and best resourced healing environment that the medieval world contains. It is a long, quiet room, its rows of simple beds separated by low wooden partitions, its windows placed to admit the maximum possible light and air, because even within the miasma theory, fresh air is understood as preferable to stale, and the infirmarian who oversees the room has arranged it with that principle in mind. The smell of the infirmary is distinctive. Lavender and vinegar, the two substances most widely used as disinfectants in a world that does not know what infection is, combined with the beeswax of the candles that burn at the far end of the room, before a small image of the Virgin, and beneath both of these the unavoidable smell of the sick, the particular sweetness of fever, but the sharper notes of wounds being dressed, the deep, heavy smell of a body working hard against something it may not overcome. The infirmarian moves between the beds with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has done this work for many years, checking the dressings on wounds, feeling foreheads for the heat of fever, administering the preparations that the monastery's herb garden has provided. The willow bark tea that reduces fever through a mechanism no one yet understands. The honey applied to wounds that inhibits the corruption of flesh through properties that will not be explained for centuries. The monastery herb garden is one of the most carefully tended spaces in the medieval world. It is laid out in formal beds, each one devoted to a specific plant, its organization reflecting both the practical requirements of the infirmary and the symbolic significance that medieval thought assigns to plants: the rose for the Virgin, the lily for purity, the hyssop of the Psalms, the rue that is the herb of grace. But the primary logic of the garden is medicinal: feverfew for the headache and the fever, valerian for the sleeplessness that illness brings, comfrey for the broken bone, its common name, knit bone, a direct description of the property attributed to it, wormwood for the intestinal parasites that afflict almost every person in the village, the silent passengers of the medieval gut, whose presence is felt in the fatigue and the cramping and the slow drain on the body's resources. The monk who tends this garden works with the knowledge of centuries behind him, the accumulated observations of generations of infirmarians encoded in the manuscripts that line the shelves of the monastery library, each recipe a small piece of hard-won understanding about what the body needs and what the earth provides. The village healer and the monastery infirmarian share a common toolkit but occupy different worlds. The infirmarian has access to manuscripts, to the formal medical tradition, to the resources of an institution that can maintain a garden and a library and a dedicated healing space. The village healer has experience, observation, and the oral tradition, knowledge transmitted not through writing, but through practice, through apprenticeship, through the accumulated wisdom of women who have attended births and deaths and the long middle ground of illness for as long as the village has existed. Both of them pray. Prayer is not separate from healing in this world. It is integral to it, the invocation of divine assistance, understood as the most powerful intervention available. The saints called upon as specialists whose particular domains of intercession correspond to particular ailments. Saint Roch for the plague, Saint Apollonia for the toothache, Saint Lawrence for the burns. The prayers are said over the patient with the same seriousness as the poultice is applied, because in the understanding of 1356, the spiritual and the physical are not separate categories of reality, but two aspects of a single condition that requires attention on both levels simultaneously. The churchyard holds the evidence of what healing cannot accomplish. The graves are close together, their markers simple, a wooden cross, a stone with no inscription, sometimes nothing at all. The children's graves are numerous, because childhood in this world is a passage through a series of illnesses that modern vaccination has made almost theoretical, and many children do not complete it. The graves of the plague years are different from the others. Larger, less individual, the ground above them still slightly disturbed, the grass not yet fully reclaimed the soil. They are the visible record of a catastrophe that reshaped the village's understanding of its own fragility, that filled the prayers of every survivor with a particular urgency, that made the herbs in the healer's cottage and the preparations in the infirmary feel not like routine care, but like a desperate, ongoing negotiation with mortality. The people who tend these graves know what the plague can do. They have seen it. Some of them have survived it, and carry in their bodies the immunity that survival confers, though they have no framework for understanding why they lived when others did not. The monastery infirmary at night is one of the quietest places the medieval world contains. The candles have been reduced to a few, their light barely reaching the far walls, casting the rows of beds in a warm, uncertain glow that makes the room feel smaller and more intimate than it does by day. The infirmarian moves through it in near silence, his soft shoes making no sound on the stone floor, pausing at each bed to listen to the breathing of the patient within. Some breathe easily, the fever broken, the body beginning the slow work of recovery. Others breathe with the labored, uneven rhythm of a body still in crisis, each breath a small effort, each exhalation a release that does not quite reach rest. The smell of lavender is strongest at night, when the day's activity has stilled, and the aromatic compounds released by the dried bundles hanging from the ceiling accumulate in the quiet air. It mingles with the beeswax of the candles and the faint, clean smell of the vinegar used to wipe down the beds, and together these smells constitute the particular atmosphere of this room. A smell of care, of attention, of the human refusal to abandon the suffering to their suffering alone. This is what the medieval world offers against illness: herbs and prayer, attention and presence, the accumulated knowledge of generations applied with genuine care to bodies that are frequently beyond its reach. It is not enough. It was never enough. The plague killed a third of Europe, and the herbs in the healer's cottage could not stop it, and the prayers said over the dying could not save them. And the plague doctors in their beaked masks moved through cities of the dead with their inadequate remedies and their genuine courage and their complete inability to address the actual mechanism of what was killing everyone around them. But the care was real. The knowledge was real, within its limits. The infirmarian who sat through the night beside a feverish patient, changing the cool cloth on the forehead, administering the willow bark tea, praying in the candle-lit quiet of the infirmary, that person was doing everything that could be done, with everything that was available, in a world that had not yet found the tools to do more. The candle burns low beside the bed. The patient breathes. The night continues, as all nights do, toward the morning that may or may not bring improvement. And the infirmarian remains, steady and present, in the quiet room that smells of herbs and beeswax, and the particular gravity of human beings caring for one another at the edge of what they know. There is a smell that travelers describe encountering long before a medieval town comes into view. It arrives on the wind as a physical presence, not a suggestion of something unpleasant, but a full, layered assault that settles into the clothing and the hair and the memory with a persistence that no amount of distance can entirely dispel. It is the smell of a civilization managing its own waste with the tools available to it in 1356, and those tools are insufficient to the scale of the problem, and have been insufficient for as long as the town has existed, and will remain insufficient for centuries still to come. To understand this smell is to understand something fundamental about the physical reality of medieval life, not as a catalogue of disgust, but as an honest account of what it meant to live in a densely inhabited world without sewers, without running water, without the invisible infrastructure that modern people never think about because it never fails them. Begin at the pinnacle of the social order, in the castle, where the sanitary arrangements are the most sophisticated available and are still, by any modern measure, deeply inadequate. The garderobe is carved into the thickness of the castle wall itself. A small stone chamber, its seat a bench of cold stone, with a hole cut through it, the hole opening onto a shaft that drops straight down through the wall's interior to a pit far below, or in some cases directly into the moat that surrounds the castle's base. There is no water to flush anything away. Gravity is the only mechanism at work, and gravity is patient but not thorough, and the shaft accumulates its own residue over time. And in summer the updraft from the pit below carries its testimony upward through the stone with a persistence that no amount of architectural ingenuity can entirely redirect. And yet, the garderobe serves a secondary purpose that reveals the particular ingenuity of a world that wastes nothing and repurposes everything. The finest clothing of the household, the velvet robes, the fur-trimmed surcoats, the expensive woolen garments that moths and fleas would destroy if left unprotected, is stored in this very chamber. The rising fumes from the waste below, concentrated with ammonia and other compounds, are potent enough to kill the insects that would otherwise ruin the fabric. The toilet is the fumigation chamber. The logic is entirely sound. The smell is the price of the service, And in a world where a velvet robe represents months of labor and considerable expense, the price is considered worth paying. This is medieval pragmatism at its most characteristic, finding use in what seems only like waste, turning the unavoidable into the functional, accepting the unpleasant as the cost of the practical. Step outside the castle walls and into the streets of a market town, and the sanitary situation transforms from uncomfortable to genuinely overwhelming. The common people have no moat, no stone shaft, no architectural solution of any kind. The communal latrine, a wooden structure built over a pit at the edge of the settlement, shared by many households, fills faster than it can be emptied, and offers privacy only in the loosest sense of the word. More commonly, the wooden bucket serves as the household's primary sanitary vessel, its contents carried to the backyard pit, or when the pit is full, or the weather is bad, or the hour is late, emptied directly into the open gutter that runs down the center of the street. The gutter is not a drainage system in any engineered sense. It is simply the lowest point of the lane, a channel worn by rain and foot, traffic, and the accumulated flow of everything the street receives, carrying its contents in the direction of the nearest river or stream at whatever pace the gradient allows. In dry weather, it barely flows at all. In heavy rain, it floods, and its contents spread across the cobblestones and into the doorways of the buildings on either side. The town has its laws regarding waste disposal, and those laws are almost universally ignored. Ordinances requiring householders to contain their waste, to use designated disposal points, to refrain from throwing the contents of chamber pots from upper windows into the street below. These exist in the records of many medieval English towns, and their repeated reenactment is itself evidence of how little effect they have. The muckrakers employed by town authorities to scrape the streets are fighting a losing battle against a tide that never stops, and their tools, wooden scrapers, hand carts, the labor of men who have accepted the worst regarded work available in exchange for whatever wage it commands, are not equal to the volume of what the town produces each day. The pigs that roam freely through the streets are, in a practical sense, the most effective sanitation workers the town employs. They consume the organic refuse thrown from windows and doorways with an efficiency that no human laborer can match, processing food, scraps, and vegetable waste, and much else besides, into something that at least reduces the volume of material accumulating on the cobblestones. They leave behind their own contributions to the street's composition, but the net effect of their presence is considered beneficial, and they are tolerated accordingly. The tanners open vats, positioned at the town's edge, where the smell will carry away from the center, add their own sharp chemical note to the atmospheric mixture. The urine, collected from households and purchased by tanners for its ammonia content, the dog feces gathered for the same purpose, both used in the preparation of hides, and both contributing to the particular industrial edge that underlies the more organic smells of the street. Travelers who have written about entering medieval cities described the experience in terms that suggest genuine physical shock, the smell arriving as a blow, the eyes watering as a blow, the eyes watering, the throat tightening, against something that the body recognizes as wrong, even before the mind has fully processed what it is encountering. And yet, the people who live within this atmosphere have adapted to it with the completeness that human beings bring to every environment they inhabit long enough. The smell is simply the smell of the town, as unremarkable to its inhabitants as the smell of the sea to those who live beside it, present in every breath, and therefore, eventually, beneath conscious notice. Beneath the wealthier merchant's house, the cesspit is a more contained solution than the open gutter, a lined pit, sometimes brick-built, into which the household's waste accumulates over months until it reaches capacity and must be emptied. This is where the gong farmers enter the story, and they enter it only at night, because the law requires it, and because the polite society of the daylight hours has arranged things so that the most necessary and most despised labor of the town is performed in darkness, out of sight, its evidence removed before morning. The gong farmer descends into the cesspit by ladder or rope, wading into the accumulated waste of months, shoveling it into buckets that are hauled up by his colleagues above and carried to the carts that will transport the contents outside the town walls, where it will be sold as fertilizer to the farmers of the surrounding fields. It is a transaction that closes a biological loop, the waste of the town returning to the soil that feeds the town, and it is, in its way, an elegant system. But the elegance is entirely invisible to the man standing waist-deep in the cesspit at 2 a.m, working by the light of a lantern held by someone standing well back from the edge. The danger of the work is not merely unpleasant, but lethal. The gases that accumulate in an enclosed cesspit, methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, can reach concentrations sufficient to render a man unconscious within seconds of descent, and unconscious in a cesspit means dead, and the records of medieval towns contain occasional entries noting the deaths of gong farmers overcome by fumes in the course of their work. They are not celebrated in the chronicles that record the deeds of lords and bishops. They are noted briefly in the accounts of the town's expenditure, their names sometimes preserved and sometimes not. Their contribution to the survival of the urban community entirely unacknowledged by the society that depended upon it. They are the necessary, invisible men of the medieval world, performing at night the work that makes the day possible, their labor the foundation beneath the foundation of everything the town considers civilized. The question of what serves in place of paper in this world has a practical answer that is as varied as the circumstances of those who require it. Moss, gathered from the banks of streams and stored in the garderobe or the privy for the purpose, is soft and absorbent and widely used where it can be obtained. Hay and straw are the standard resource in agricultural settings, available in every barn and stable yard, their texture rough but their availability reliable. Broad leaves in summer when the hedgerows provide them. Scraps of worn linen too degraded for any other use, repurposed for this final function before being discarded. The wealthy use soft wool or dedicated cloths of finer fabric. The Romans had used a sponge on a stick, soaked in vinegar and shared between users of the public latrine, a solution that was more hygienic than most of what replaced it, and that had been lost entirely by 1356. Its modest technology forgotten, along with the infrastructure that had supported it. The biological consequences of this sanitary environment accumulate quietly throughout the population. Hands that have touched the privy and have not been washed, because washing requires water, and water requires carrying, and the connection between unwashed hands and illness has not yet been established in any framework that medieval medicine recognizes. Prepare the food that goes into the pot. The water, drawn from the well, receives the drainage of the yard that surrounds it. The intestinal parasites that thrive in this environment of constant reinfection are present in almost every body in the village, from the blacksmith to stall, the bishop. Their presence felt as a background drain on energy and nutrition that is simply accepted as the normal condition of being alive. This is the parasitic tax that the sanitary environment levies on every person who lives within it, a portion of every meal consumed not by the person who ate it, but by the organisms that have made their home in the gut, organisms that are invisible, unnamed, and entirely beyond the reach of any remedy that 1356 possesses. And yet the town persists. The market continues to be held, the trades to be practiced, the church to be attended, the children to be born and raised and set to work. The systems of waste management that exist, the gutter, the cesspit, the gong farmer, the roaming pig, are overwhelmed and imperfect, and sometimes catastrophically inadequate, but they are systems, the product of accumulated experience and practical necessity, doing what they can with what is available. The seasonal flooding that periodically scours the streets is understood as a cleansing, a natural intervention that does what the muckrakers cannot, carrying the accumulated debris of months toward the river in a rush of brown water that leaves the cobblestones briefly relatively clean. The cold of winter slows the biological processes that make the summer streets most dangerous, reducing the smell and the active fermentation of organic matter to a more manageable level. The town adapts to its own conditions, as human settlements always do, finding the equilibrium that allows life to continue within constraints that seem, from the outside, impossible to inhabit. The gong farmer finishes his work before the people. First light appears in the eastern sky. He climbs out of the emptied pit, his clothing carrying the evidence of the night's labor in a way that no amount of distance will quickly diminish. The cart is loaded. The cesspit is covered. By the time the household above it wakes and begins its day, the evidence of the night's work is gone, and the town presents its daylight face. Imperfect, malodorous by any modern standard, but functional, inhabited, alive. The gong farmer moves through the empty streets toward the town gate, the cart's wheels loud on the cobblestones in the pre-dawn, quiet, carrying the town's waste outward to the fields that will receive it, and, in time, return it as grain and vegetable, and the bread that will be baked and eaten and begin the cycle again. It is unglamorous work, it is essential work, and in the logic of a world that wastes nothing and repurposes everything. It is in its way the most honest labor the town contains, the work of closing the loop, of returning to the earth what the earth has given, of maintaining the conditions under which everything else remains possible. Before the gong farmer has reached the town gate, before the first household has drawn its morning water, the bell has already spoken. It speaks from the stone tower at the center of the village, or from the great campanile of the monastery on the hill above the town, and its voice carries across the frozen fields and the sleeping lanes with a clarity that no other sound in this world can match. Not the rooster, not the wind, not the creak of timber in the cold. The bell is the voice of time itself in 1356, and time in this world is not a neutral measurement, but a sacred architecture, a structure built by the Church across every hour of every day, dividing the darkness and the light into 8 portions of prayer that give the day its shape and its meaning. These are the canonical hours, the officium divinum, the divine office, the opus Dei, the work of God, and they have been structuring the days of monks and nuns, and in a looser and more approximate sense, the days of every person who lives within earshot of a church bell, for centuries before 1356. The 8 hours begin before dawn with matins, the night office, when the monastery is still dark, and the monks rise from their beds in the dormitory and move in silence through the cold cloister to the chapel, their breath visible in the candlelight, their feet finding the worn stone path by memory rather than sight. Then Lauds at first light, prime at sunrise, tertiary at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in the mid-afternoon, vespers at evening, and finally Compline, the last prayer of the day, the closing of the divine office, after which the monastery falls into the great silence that will hold until Matins calls the cycle to begin again. The monastery cloister at dawn is one of the most particular environments the medieval world contains. It is a square of covered walkway surrounding an open garden, its stone columns supporting a vaulted roof that shelters the path from rain but not from cold. The garden at its center, planted with herbs and flowers, whose symbolism is as carefully considered as their practical use. The monks move through this space in single file, their dark habits gathering the shadows, their faces bent toward the ground in a posture of recollection that the rule of Saint Benedict prescribes for movement between the spaces of the monastery. They do not speak. The silence is not merely the absence of conversation, but a positive condition, a quality of attention that the rule describes as essential to the life of prayer, the stilling of the outer noise so that the inner voice can be heard. The sound of their feet on the stone, the faint rustle of their habits, the distant drip of water from the gargoyle at the cloister's corner, these are the sounds of the dawn office, and they have been the sounds of this particular dawn, in this particular cloister, every morning for as long as the monastery has stood. The chapel receives them. It is a long, narrow space, its ceiling vaulted in stone, its walls bare of the elaborate decoration that the great cathedrals display. This is a monastic chapel. This is a monastic chapel, its aesthetic governed by the Benedictine preference for simplicity, its beauty residing in proportion and light rather than in ornament. The candles on the altar are already burning, lit by the sacristan before the community assembled, their flames steady in the still air of the chapel, their light falling on the carved stone of the altar and the painted wooden figure of the Virgin in her niche and the crucifix that hangs above the east window, where the first grey light of dawn is beginning to show. The monks take their places in the choir stalls, carved wooden seats that fold up when not in use, their misericords carved with the faces of animals and grotesques that seem incongruous in this space of prayer, but are entirely characteristic of a world that finds the sacred and the earthy in constant proximity. The chanting begins, the Latin of the Psalms rising in the antiphonal pattern that sets one side of the choir against the other, the sound filling the stone space with a resonance that the architecture seems designed to amplify and sustain. The village church is a different kind of sacred space, and it serves a different kind of community. It is the largest stone building most villages will ever enter. Its walls 3 feet thick, its floor of cold stone worn smooth in the places where generations of feet have stood and knelt and shuffled toward the altar rail. The interior is not the bare, whitewashed space that later centuries will make of it. In 1356, the walls are painted. Every surface that can receive paint has received it. The vivid scenes of the Last Judgment above the chancel arch, where the saved rise toward a golden heaven and the damned are dragged toward the red and orange of hell by grinning demons. The stories of the saints in their panels along the nave walls, their faces stylized and their colors still bright, despite the smoke of decades of candles and the damp that works at the plaster from behind. The windows are small and set high in the walls, their glass clear or lightly tinted, admitting a pale, diffuse light that falls across the painted surfaces and the stone floor and the bodies of the congregation gathered for Sunday Mass. The smell of the church is the smell of all the Sundays that have preceded this one. Tallow smoke and incense, the particular cold stone smell of a building that never fully warms, the accumulated breath of a community that has been gathering in this space for as long as anyone can remember. Time exupe 1500 millicascents. Sunday Mass is the central communal event of the week, and the church fills with the bodies of the village in a way that no other occasion produces. The congregation stands. There are no pews in most village churches of 1356. The floor is open and the people stand for the duration of the Mass, which may last an hour or more, depending on the occasion and the priest's inclinations. They stand close together, the warmth of their bodies, the only warmth the building offers, their wool clothing, releasing its particular smell in the heat of proximity, the children pressed against the legs of their parents, the elderly finding places near the walls where they can lean. The Latin of the Mass is not understood by most of those present. It is the language of the church, not of the village, and the priest performs the liturgy at the altar with his back to the congregation, his voice sometimes too quiet to carry to the back of the nave. But the incomprehension is not experienced as exclusion. The Mass is not a lecture to be followed, but a mystery to be witnessed, a sacred action performed in the presence of the community, its power residing not in the understanding of the words, but in the reality of what those words are understood to accomplish. The transformation of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, present on the altar, real and immediate, the center of the entire world. The great cathedrals being built and extended across Europe in 1356 are the most ambitious structures the medieval world has yet produced, and to enter one is to experience an architecture of deliberate awe. The nave of a Gothic cathedral rises to heights that seem to a person accustomed to the low ceilings of a cottage, or even the modest vault of a village church, almost impossible. 60, 80, 100 feet of stone soaring upward to a ribbed vault that seems to float above the clerestory windows, its weight carried not by the walls, but by the flying buttresses that press against the exterior, allowing the walls to be opened into vast expanses of colored glass. The light that enters through these windows is unlike any other light in the medieval world. It is colored deep blue and ruby red and the gold of amber, the green of forest light, and it falls across the stone floor in pools and patterns that shift as the sun moves, painting the interior of the cathedral with a luminosity that seems to come from within the stone itself. This is intentional. The theology of light that underlies Gothic architecture understands the colored light of the windows as a material manifestation of divine illumination, the light of God made visible, entering the world through glass, as grace enters the soul, through prayer, transforming the ordinary into the radiant. The monastery scriptorium is another sacred space, though its sanctity is of a quieter, more intellectual kind. It is a long room, its writing desks arranged to catch the maximum light from the windows on the south wall, each desk occupied by a monk bent over his work in the posture of intense concentration that the copying of manuscripts demands. The work is slow and exacting, each letter formed with a quill cut from a goose feather, dipped in ink made from oak galls and iron sulfate, drawn across the prepared surface of vellum with a steadiness of hand that must be maintained for hours at a time. The manuscripts being copied are the texts on which the entire intellectual life of the medieval world depends. The scriptures, the commentaries of the Church Fathers, the works of Aristotle and Galen transmitted through Arabic scholarship, the chronicles and histories and theological treatises that constitute the written record of everything the civilization knows about itself and its world. The smell of the scriptorium is distinctive. The slightly animal smell of the vellum made from stretched and scraped sheepskin, the sharp, metallic smell of the ink, the beeswax of the candles that supplement the window light on dark days, and beneath all of these, the particular smell of concentration, of minds at work in silence, on tasks that require everything they have. The Church in 1356 is not only a spiritual institution, it is the primary institution of education, of record-keeping, of hailing, and of social organization across the whole of Western Europe. The monastery maintains the school where the sons of the nobility and the occasional gifted child of lesser birth learn to read and write in Latin, the language of the Church, and therefore the language of all formal knowledge. It maintains the library where the accumulated learning of centuries is preserved in manuscripts that exist nowhere else, their survival dependent on the care of the monks who copy and repair and store them. It maintains the infirmary, the herb garden, the guest house for travelers, the almshouse for the poor, a network of practical services that the secular world has no other institution to provide. The abbot of a great monastery is a figure of political as well as spiritual authority, his house a center of economic activity, his lands worked by tenants whose relationship to the monastery mirrors in many ways the relationship of the peasant to the secular lord. The church is everywhere in this world, not as an imposition on a secular life that would otherwise exist independently, but as the framework within which all life is organized and understood, the source of the calendar that structures the year, the bell that structures the day, the prayers that structure the hours, the sacraments that mark the passages from birth to death. The herb garden, maintained by the monks, serves both the infirmary and the altar. The same rosemary that is used in healing preparations is used to perfume the church on feast days, its sharp, resinous fragrance rising in the warm air of the nave and mingling with the incense that the thurifer swings in its silver vessel before the altar. The same lavender that soothes the fevered patient in the infirmary is strewn on the floor of the chapel on the feast of the Virgin, its scent released underfoot by the passage of the community at prayer. The boundary between the medicinal and the sacred is not a boundary that the medieval mind recognizes with any clarity. The plants that heal the body are understood as gifts of divine providence, their properties placed in them by God for the use of human beings, their cultivation an act of gratitude as much as of practical necessity. The monk who tends the herb garden is performing a spiritual exercise as well as a horticultural one, his attention to the plants a form of contemplation, his care for their growth a participation in the ongoing work of creation. Break, time equal to 2,500 milliseconds. As the day moves toward its close, the canonical hours continue their marking of time. None sounds in the mid-afternoon, its bell reaching the fields where the laborers are still at work, a reminder that the day has a structure beyond the demands of the harvest, that the hours belong to God before they belong to the Lord. Vespers sounds at evening, and in the village church the priest lights the candles before the altar and says the evening office alone, or with the small number of parishioners who have made it their practice to attend, their voices joining his in the responses that the liturgy requires. The light in the church at Vespers is the light of candles against the gathering dark outside the windows, a warm, unsteady light that makes the painted saints on the walls seem to move slightly, their expressions shifting between severity and compassion as the flames waver in the draughts that find their way through the stone. The smell of incense from the morning's mass still lingers in the cold air of the nave, a ghost of the day's liturgy, fading but present, the way the memory of prayer persists in a space that has held it long enough In the monastery, the community gathers for Compline as the last light fails entirely outside the chapel windows. Compline is the shortest of the canonical hours, its texts few and familiar, its tone one of quiet surrender, the handing over of the day to God, the acknowledgement that the night belongs to a darkness that human effort cannot illuminate, the prayer for protection through the hours of sleep that the rule describes as a small image of death. The monks stand in their choir stalls as the cantor intones the opening verse, their voices joining in the response with the ease of texts said so many times that they have passed beyond memory into the body itself, known in the muscles of the throat and the breath before they are known in the mind. The Psalms of Compline are the psalms of trust and of rest, the shepherd's psalm, the psalm of the one who neither slumbers nor sleeps, the psalm of the night watch, waiting for the morning. When the office ends, the candles are extinguished, one by one. The sacristan moves along the altar with a snuffer, and each flame disappears in a small curl of smoke that rises briefly in the darkness and is gone. The chapel fills with a darkness that is not quite total. The sanctuary lamp before the tabernacle continues to burn, its small red flame, the one light that the rule permits to remain through the night, the one point of warmth in the cold stone space. The monks file out in silence, returning through the cloister to the dormitory, their feet finding the familiar path in the dark, the great silence settling over the monastery like a second darkness, deeper and more complete than the physical night outside. The bell will sound again for matins before the night is half over, calling them back to the chapel, back to the Psalms, back to the work of God that the rule describes as the first and most important work of the monastic life, more important than the copying of manuscripts, more important than the tending of the herb garden, more important than the care of the sick in the infirmary, the Opus Dei, the work of God, the prayer that holds the world together. Outside the monastery walls, the village has settled into its own version of the night's quiet. The church bell has spoken its last for the day, and the stone tower stands dark against the stars, its bell silent until morning calls it back to speech. The cottages are sealed against the cold, their fires banked, their families gathered in the warmth that the hearth still offers. The painted saints on the church walls stand in their darkness, their colors invisible, now their stories waiting for the morning light to make them legible again. The candle before the altar burns on, steady and small, the one light in the village that the night does not extinguish, a point of warmth in the cold stone, a presence in the dark, the church's quiet insistence that even in the deepest hour of the night, something watches, something holds, something remains. The last light leaves the sky slowly in 1356. It does not switch off, does not dim at the touch of anything human. It simply withdraws, the pale grey of the western horizon deepening through shades of blue and violet, and finally into a darkness so complete that a modern person, accustomed to the perpetual amber glow of street lamps and lit windows and the distant luminescence of cities, would find it genuinely disorienting. There is no light pollution in this world. There is no light at all beyond the reach of flame, and flame is precious, and flame is finite, and when the tallow candle gutters and goes out in the cottage window, the darkness that replaces it is absolute. This is how the medieval night begins, not as a transition, but as an arrival, a presence, something that comes in from outside and fills every space that warmth and fire have not already claimed. The village seals itself against the dark with what it has. The wooden shutters are drawn across the window openings. There is no glass in most cottage windows, only the shutter against the cold and the night, and when it is closed the room becomes its own small world, bounded by the firelight that still plays across the low ceiling and the rough walls. The animals in their corner have settled, the goat folded into itself, the chickens roosted on their perch, their small bodies giving off a warmth that is not nothing in a room where the fire is being banked for the night, its fuel reduced to a careful minimum that will hold the embers through the dark hours without consuming the wood that must last until morning. The smell of the room at this hour is its most concentrated. The smoke and the animals, and the damp rushes, and the remnants of the evening's pottage still clinging to the iron pot, all of it held close by the closed shutters, a dense, particular atmosphere that is the smell of this family, this household, this specific life. The straw pallet against the far wall is the center of the night's world. It is not a bed in any modern sense. There is no frame, no mattress of springs or foam, no individual sleeping space. It is a large flat sack of rough linen stuffed with straw laid directly on the earthen floor, wide enough to hold the entire family in proximity. The coarse wool blankets, 2 of them, undyed, the color of the sheep they came from, are pulled over the bodies that arrange themselves beneath them with the practiced efficiency of people who have been sleeping this way all their lives. The children go in the middle, where the warmth of the adults on either side is greatest. The elderly woman whose breathing is audible in the quiet takes her place at the edge, her body curved inward against the cold that the wall behind her never entirely releases. They press together not from tenderness alone, but from necessity, each body a source of heat, each body warming the bodies beside it, the collective warmth of the group making survivable what no single body could sustain alone through a January night. The linen of the sheets, coarser than anything a modern hand would recognize as bedding, has been in use since autumn and carries in its fibers the accumulated warmth and smell of the bodies that have lain in it through the cold months. It will be washed in spring, beaten against stones in the stream, and spread on the grass to bleach in the weak April sun. And until then, it is what it is, functional, imperfect, entirely familiar to those who sleep within it. The straw of the pallet rustles with every movement, a sound so constant and so expected that it has long since ceased to register as anything other than the sound of settling, the sound of the body finding its position for the night. The straw is compacted now, months into the winter, its cushioning reduced. The earthen floor beneath it presents a firmness that the body has learned to accommodate. In the wealthier household, the yeoman farmer, the prosperous merchant, there might be a box bed, a wooden frame with sides, raised off the floor, its mattress stuffed with wool or feathers rather than straw, its curtains drawn against the draughts that move through even the best-built rooms at night. But for most of the village, the pallet on the floor is the bed, and the floor is the foundation, and the cold of the earth comes up through both. The tallow candle on the shelf beside the door has been burning since dusk, its flame small and slightly smoky, its light barely reaching the far wall. Tallow, rendered animal fat, most often from cattle or sheep, burns with a softer, yellower flame than beeswax, and with a smell that is faintly rancid. The smell of fat heated past its comfort, a smell that has settled into the walls and the ceiling and the clothing of every person in this room over the course of many winters. The candle is extinguished now, pinched out between dampened fingers, and the room darkens to the dim, unsteady light of the banked hearth, a faint orange glow from the bed of embers, enough to see shapes, but not faces, enough to navigate the room, but not to read or work. This is the light of the medieval night, and it is the last light the family will see until morning coaxes the fire back to life. The sounds of the medieval night are their own world. The creak of the timber frame as the temperature drops and the wood contracts, a sound so familiar that it is heard without being heard, absorbed into the background of sleep, the way rain on a roof is absorbed, the wind finding the gaps in the thatch and producing a low variable note that rises and falls with the gusts, sometimes a whisper and sometimes something closer to a moan. The occasional shift of the goat in its corner, the small sounds of the chickens resettling on their perch, and from outside, carried through the shuttered window on the cold air, the distant bark of a dog, somewhere in the village, a sound that travels with extraordinary clarity in the frozen night, reaching across the dark lanes and the silent cottages to announce itself and then fall quiet again. Somewhere, perhaps an hour into the night, the church bell sounds, not the full peal of the canonical hours, but a single, measured toll marking the passage of time, the night watch's confirmation that the hours are being counted, that the darkness is not without structure, that the morning will come. Medieval sleep is not the unbroken 8-hour block that modern medicine prescribes and modern life imperfectly achieves. The understanding of sleep in 1356, not as a theory but as lived experience, as the natural pattern of the body in the long winter nights, divides the night into two distinct phases, separated by a period of wakefulness that is considered entirely natural, expected, and purposeful. The first sleep begins at nightfall and lasts for several hours, a deep and relatively dreamless rest that the body enters readily after the physical exhaustion of the day's labor. Then, somewhere in the middle of the night, perhaps at midnight, perhaps a little after, the sleeper wakes, not from disturbance, not from illness, but simply because the body has completed its first cycle and is ready for something else. This waking is quiet and unhurried. The monk uses it for prayer, rising in the darkness to say the night office that the rule prescribes, his voice low in the cold chapel, the sanctuary lamp the only light. The peasant uses it for reflection or for quiet conversation with a spouse in the darkness, or for the small tasks that the day's busyness left undone. Mending a tool by firelight, checking on the animals, tending the banked fire. The period between the first sleep and the second is not experienced as insomnia. It is simply the middle of the night, a time that belongs to a different quality of consciousness than either sleep or the full wakefulness of the day, softer, more interior, more given to the kind of thought that the busy hours do not accommodate. The medieval writers who mention it do so without alarm, as one mentions the weather or the season, a condition of life, unremarkable, expected. It is only later, when artificial light extends the waking day and compresses the night into a single block of unconsciousness, that this natural rhythm will be lost, its disappearance so gradual that the people who lose it will not notice what is gone. In 1356, the night is still long enough to hold both sleeps and the quiet wakefulness between them, and the body moves through this pattern as naturally as it moves through hunger and satiation, through cold and warmth, through the rhythms that the day and the season impose. The cold that returns to the room after the fire has been banked is a recurring presence throughout the night. It comes in stages. First, the gradual cooling of the air as the fire's output diminishes, then the settling of the cold from the walls and the floor as the stored warmth of the day dissipates, then the deeper cold of the small hours when the temperature outside has reached its lowest and the room has given up everything it had. The bodies beneath the wool blankets respond by drawing closer together, by pulling the blankets higher by the unconscious adjustments of sleep that keep the core warm at the expense of the extremities, the feet that are always cold by morning, the hands that curl inward toward the chest, the face that burrows into the rough linen of the palate. The cold is not dangerous, not tonight. The fire holds enough heat in its embers to prevent the room from reaching the temperature that would threaten life, and the bodies beneath the blankets generate enough warmth between them to sustain themselves through the dark hours. But it is present, always present, the reminder that the warmth of the room is borrowed and must be renewed each morning. Outside the cottage, the village exists in a darkness that is total and a silence that is very nearly so. The lanes between the cottages are invisible, not dim, not shadowed, but genuinely invisible, the darkness so complete that a person stepping outside without a lantern would be navigating entirely by memory and touch, feeling for the edge of the path with their feet, moving through a world reduced to sound and cold, and the faint smell of wood smoke still rising from the banked fires within. The stars above the village are extraordinary in this darkness. Without any artificial light to compete with them, they fill the sky with a density and a brilliance that a modern person living near any town or city has never seen. The Milky Way, a genuine river of light, across the black, the individual stars, sharp and unwavering in the cold, clear air of a January night. The people of 1356 live beneath this sky every night of their lives, and they know it with. An intimacy that the lit world has taken from its successors. The stars as a clock, as a compass, as the backdrop against which the angels move and the saints intercede, and the divine order of the universe makes itself visible to anyone willing to stand in the cold and look up. The stone church at the center of the village stands in this darkness with the quiet authority of something built to outlast the night. Its walls are 3 feet thick and hold the cold as completely as they hold the warmth, and within them the single candle before the altar burns on, the one light in the village that the night does not extinguish, the church's quiet insistence that even in the deepest hour something watches. The painted saints on the walls are invisible now, their colors swallowed by the dark, their stories suspended until the morning light returns to make them legible. The stone floor is cold enough to ache, and the air inside the church is the same temperature as the air outside. The thick walls preserving the cold as faithfully as they preserve everything else. But the candle burns, small and steady, its flame barely moving in the still air. It holds its position in the darkness with a persistence that seems, in the logic of this world, to mean something, to be a statement about the nature of light and darkness, about the relationship between the human and the divine, about the possibility of warmth in a cold world. The second sleep comes more gently than the first. The body, having moved through its waking interval, settles back into unconsciousness with the ease of something returning to a familiar place, and the dreams that come into a self. And so, this second sleep are understood by the medieval mind as more significant than those of the first, closer to the surface of meaning, more likely to carry messages from the divine or the demonic, more worthy of attention and interpretation in the morning. The family on their pallet breathes together in the darkness, their rhythms gradually synchronizing, the children deeply under, the adults in the lighter sleep of the second phase, aware at some level of the cold and the dark and the sounds of the night without being troubled by them. The goat shifts, the fire settles, the wind moves through the thatch with its low variable voice. This is the world of 1356 at its most reduced, stripped of its labor and its noise and its social complexity, returned to the simplest possible version of itself. Bodies in the dark, beneath wool, breathing together, waiting for the morning that will call them back to the cold and the fire and the iron pot and the strip fields and the church bell and all the rest of it. There is nothing here that a modern person would recognize as comfort by the standards of the world that has replaced this one. No soft mattress, no controlled temperature, no individual space, no silence that is truly silent, no darkness that is chosen rather than imposed. And yet the people sleeping here are not suffering, not in this moment. They are resting as human beings have always rested, in the way that their world has shaped them to rest, their bodies adapted to its demands with the completeness that long habituation produces. What remains when the last candle has been extinguished and the village has fallen into its deepest quiet is something that resists easy description. It is the fact of these lives, the totality of them, the extraordinary effort required simply to sustain them from one morning to the next, the cold endured, and the hunger managed, and the illness survived, and the grief absorbed, and the prayers said, and the work done, and the bread baked, and the fields ploughed, and the children raised, and the dead buried, and the seasons ploughed, and the children raised, and the dead buried, and the seasons turned, and the bell answered, morning after morning, year after year, in a world that offered no comfort it did not demand be earned. These were not diminished people. They were not primitive people, not pitiable people, not people waiting to be rescued by the centuries of invention that would eventually arrive. They were people living with full intensity in the only world available to them, bringing to it the full range of human capacity, ingenuity and tenderness, faith and endurance. Faith and endurance, the deep knowledge of the soil and the sky and the body's limits and the heart's persistence. The last cottage window goes dark, the tallow candle pinched out, the shutter drawn, the family beneath their blankets, the fire holding its embers against the morning. The village is entirely still now, its lanes empty, its animals settled, its people given over to the darkness and the cold and the particular mercy of sleep. The stars above it are extraordinary. The church stands at its center, patient and cold and lit by its single flame. The strip fields beyond the last cottage lie under frost, their ridge and furrow pattern invisible in the dark but present, pressed into the earth by generations of labor that will outlast every person who performed it. Time great, 900 milliseconds. The world of 1356 has closed its eyes. It will open them again when the bell speaks and the fire is coaxed back to life and the cold morning begins its slow negotiation with the warmth that human hands can make. But for now, in this hour, it rests beneath the same cold and indifferent sky that has always been there and always will be, long after the last memory of this world has passed into the silence from which all worlds eventually come.